My guest tonight is Dr. Nancy Turner Banks. She's a speaker, activist, and an award-winning author. Dr. Banks is a graduate of Hunter College and Harvard Medical School. She completed her internship and residency in general surgery and obstetrics and gynecology at St. Luke's and Mount Sinai Hospital and Medical Center. She was a Galloway Fellow in Gynecological Oncology at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Dr. Banks has a master's degree in finance from Pace University. She's the author of AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire, the Deadly Virus of International Greed, which is the subject of our discussion tonight. Dr. Banks, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for calling, and I'm glad to be with you this evening.
Well, you're welcome, and I thank you for coming on the show. Listen, your book is wonderfully written and is a must-read for anyone wishing to understand the history of our world and how the world really works. AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire draws a connection between the so-called free market strategies, corporate malfeasance, political corruption, and narcotics trafficking, globalism, depopulation, and the various wars and revolutions that affect our world, and as well as the financial crises of the past century, to today's healthcare crises like HIV and AIDS, cancer and autism, and any other health problems we face. So when you wrote this book, I mean, were you really intending to bite off this much of a piece?
No, it's just as I looked at the pieces, it actually was a much bigger issue.
Okay.
And how it started is that I really I'm a gynecologist, so that means as an obstetrician gynecologist, I'm supposed to be one of the people who are expertly trained in sexually transmitted diseases. And so they were saying that HIV was sexually transmitted, but we weren't seeing that in our clinics, and it was in the population originally that was coming down with this disease were primarily gay males and intravenous drug users. So for me, it seemed as if there was something environmental that was really causing the problem. And then I read a book by Peter Duesberg, and Peter Duesberg is one of the world-renowned virologists out of California, and he actually said that the HIV crisis was a subset of the drug crisis that hit the United States. And for those who belong to the baby boom generation, when we grew up in America, there were almost no drugs in our communities. And then all of a sudden in the 60s, and as the Vietnam War went on, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So there was a change in the mores and the habits of that generation. And then what happened, especially with the gay community, there was this gay liberation, and there developed in the major urban areas these what they called gay ghettos, basically in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And there's a subset of the homosexual population that was having a huge amount of unprotected sex. They were doing some very unsavory habits, including a lot of drugs. And so after about 5 or 6 years of these toxic things that they were taking, including antibiotics on an irregular basis, they suppressed their immune systems. And so when they showed up in the emergency room, rather than dealing with the drugs that were actually part and parcel of the American government sort of secret group who are sponsoring overthrows of governments with this drug money, the young people in the United States became victims of their own country. And that was sort of appalling to me, but also it spoke to why they needed a cover story for this particular problem. And it's ongoing. We see that with this Zika virus now. Mm-hmm. So it's not just, a lot of people say, well, what does that have to do with me? But we see almost every year there's some the CDC and the World Health Organization is claiming that there's some outbreak of a virus. But when you go to the areas and you see whether it's Ebola or Zika, what you find is poverty, pollution. It may be a war zone. So these are the things that destabilize the society, that they don't have, sanitation, they don't have proper water, they may be psychologically under a lot of stress, and people develop diseases. And the toxins, especially in agricultural areas that companies like Monsanto and Syngenta are using, that are highly toxic to organisms, it turns out that humans and microbes have the same types of cells. So that humans, especially developing embryos, are going to be impacted. So what I looked at, because I was a physician and because I also had a background in finance, I looked at the big picture. And so the outbreak of AIDS to me was related to the drug crisis that struck the United States in the late 60s and early 70s. And then I started looking at the science, and the science was absolutely bogus. So there was an agenda, and so I looked at that agenda and I began to draw the connections with some broader issues in the society.
I think the book that Peter Duisberg, is that Inventing the AIDS Virus?
Yes, you mean Duisberg's book?
Yeah.
Yeah, The Inventing of the AIDS Virus.
Yeah. So you were looking at the bigger picture, or the broader picture, the issues that basically these health problems that you were seeing and the medical community was seeing and we were seeing in the media was a consequence of various lifestyle choices and the changes in society that were created in the 60s with the tumult of the 60s, the Vietnam War, and also the sexual revolution.
Exactly.
And I guess a keen medical eye, or at least an honest look at the situation, would have said, well, these are classic conditions of people whose immune systems are just simply overwhelmed.
Right. I mean, the young men who were turning up in the emergency room had years of, the number of sexual partners that they would have in a day would be astounding to almost anybody. They were engaging in a process, something called fisting, which is, fisting, putting a fist in the rectum and other kinds of things in the rectum. So there was a lot of damage and tearing to the rectum, which meant that a lot of bacteria was able to get into the bloodstream. So, but one of the drugs that they were taking is something called amyl nitrate, it started out, they called it poppers, and it was really put on the market by a pharmaceutical company called Burroughs Wellcome, which started out in Britain. And the drug originally was to prevent angina. People used it if they had chest pain, because it would dilate the blood vessels to the heart. But the gay community found that it was sort of an aphrodisiac and relaxed the sphincter muscles of the rectum, so it facilitated anal sex. So there was lots of this. But of course, nitrites are cancer causing. But they also compete with the oxygen carrier, the heme oxygen carrier in the red blood cells. So they decrease the amount of oxygen that's going to your cells. Well, if you don't have the amount of oxygen that you need, you're not able to make the amount of energy that you need. If you don't have the energy that you need, your immune system is not going to operate properly.
And
it's a no-brainer.
This is oxidative stress in the book?
It's basically oxidative stress.
And this affects the mitochondria, which also could lead to all forms of cancer, correct?
Right, because this is something that is rather new material, because heretofore the biology has been ruled by molecular biology and genetic determinism, both of which have proven useful but not predictive, and a scientific theory has to be predictive. And so what does genetic determinism says? It says basically that the central nucleus controls the cell, and the communication in the cell was one way. That is, the nucleus communicated with the cell, and it was sort of the overarching mediator of all things that happened within the cell. But that's really not true. The eukaryotic cell is really a marriage of two cells that happened about 2 billion years ago. and with two different bacteria. One bacteria was an anaerobic bacteria, and the other bacteria was a facultative anaerobe. That means it could use oxygen or it could not use oxygen to make energy. But what happened when these two bacteria got together, the one bacteria turned into what we call the mitochondria, where most of our high energy is produced, the most efficient energy is produced in our cells. But most of the DNA from that bacteria were transferred to the central nucleus. So the nuclei of the eukaryotic cell, which are the types of cells we humans have, is actually a chimera. It has two genomes. It has the original genome from the first prokaryote bacteria, and it has almost all of the genes from the mitochondria. The mitochondria just retains a few genes. So there is this communication back and forth between the mitochondria and the central nucleus all the time. And that communication is through what we call redox reactions. That's reactions that either have a plus or a minus sign, to make it simple, but also through the creation of electromagnetic energy, so that we are energetic beings at that level. And unfortunately, because of the genetic determinist view, we never look at the holistic way in which the cell is functioning. And so that has become a problem in terms of diagnosing disease. For example, the virologist, when they're looking at cells, if a cell is under stress, the cell actually is able to send out damaged parts of itself. And if you look at that under a microscope, it looks like tiny particles. And I think a lot of the times when the virologists look at those particles, they call them viruses. But most of the time, they're just stressed oxidative particles that have been extruded from the cell. So when I looked at what was going on with these AIDS patients, if anyone does a search of the literature, you can look, there are almost 700 papers now which declare that HIV and AIDS patients are deficient in a nutrient called glutathione, and it's a nutrient that has sulfur. So these patients are sulfur deficient. What is the importance of that? The importance of that, if you have too much oxidative stress, you have to have something that reduces that stress, and sulfur is the molecule that does that. So the patients have a particular metabolic imbalance. That's basically what it was. And it's not infectious, which means you don't get it by sex. There's no pandemic. The pandemic never occurred. And it's reversible.
Mm-hmm. Just with sort of detoxifying, a healthier lifestyle, a better more nutritious diet, cleaner environment.
Right, and most of the gay people who refuse to take the AZT, which was a cancer type drug, are alive and well. If they change their lifestyle, they calm themselves down and they begin to take care of themselves and eat a better diet and take the nutrients that they needed. They are alive and well without having ever taken those drugs. When almost all of the people who took AZT, that initial cohort, are dead.
And there's also a test among a high-risk group. That would be female prostitutes, I think you cite in the book, or at least you cited this in an interview that I listened to. I don't know which one.
Right.
Where the prostitutes that didn't take drugs didn't have AIDS, but the ones that did take drugs had the symptoms of so-called AIDS. Right,
exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. So there is a syndrome, and this is the thing also I think people should know. This is the theory, because it's been shorthanded to HIV/AIDS, but what the theory posits is that this virus that they call HIV causes AID, the acquired immune deficiency. Now, AID is defined as a decrease in circulating lymphocytes. Well, that's unfortunate, because many things can cause a decrease in circulating lymphocytes. Other viral infections, pregnancy, stress, overtrained athletes, any number of things can cause a decrease in circulating lymphocytes, which don't lead to the syndrome. Now, the syndrome is 29 different diseases, 2 of which are cancers, Kaposi's sarcoma and lymphoma. So how one virus can cause 29 diseases, that's another clue that it's an absurdity. Mm-hmm. Because it's simply not possible, especially because when they looked to try to find the virus in the cells that were dying, they couldn't find it.
And they've never isolated the virus.
They've never isolated the virus. Now, people say, well, how could that be? Because what they're calling a virus is not a virus. It's a combination of certain findings that they have discovered that they collectively decided to call a virus. And this is what people should understand, that the rules in bacteriology and virology, there are certain rules which are in place. The bacterial isolation rules have been in place for over 100 years. The virology rules were put in place beginning in the 60s and were updated in the 70s. And they include a few extra steps, such as high-speed centrifugation, and also to look at the pellet that you get after the centrifuge. You look at it under an electron microscope. So basically, after you spin the pellet, the virus should be in a particular layer. And it should only be virus if you have isolated it. But what happened is when they did the spinning and they got the pellet, it was full of debris. And there were some particles that looked like they might be viral. But unfortunately, they weren't. Because 13 years after Gallo and Montagnier, who were the original people to do the studies, 2 studies were done, one at the National Cancer Institute in the United States and one by a French-German consortium, and they followed the original protocols for isolation. And all they found was debris. Now, which were, the cell's own molecules. And they pointed to some things in the pictures which they called viruses. But unfortunately, the retrovirus, which HIV is considered a retrovirus, have particular characteristics and a particular size. And in their own pictures, they put a measuring rod at the bottom. So if you measure what they're calling the HIV, they're 2 to 2.5 times as big as what they're saying the HIV is. So, there are so many irregularities in the science. You can't even call it science. It's an intentional fraud. And if we had any kind of integrity at the upper echelons of our medical complex, this wouldn't have gone on for 30 years. But really, it's not about getting people better. It's about selling pharmaceutical products.
Yeah. Now, another contradiction is that, from what I understand, is HIV has been identified as a retrovirus?
Well, no, it hasn't been. This is the deal. So anyway, let's go back to they didn't follow the protocols. Mm-hmm. So what they found is an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. And this was sort of like during the Nixon war on cancer period when they were thinking that the cancer might be an infectious disease, which it is not. So they discovered this reverse transcriptase because they were looking at cancer cells, and because they thought cancer was caused by these viruses, when they found this particular enzyme, they assumed that this enzyme must belong to a virus that was causing cancer. You see, it was an assumption. There was no proof. So whenever they found this reverse transcriptase, they assumed that they had discovered a virus. But the reverse transcriptase also had to be associated with some other things. For example, supposedly the people who had a particular disease would have particular proteins that would be associated with this so-called virion. However, again, when one looks at the HIV proteins, what you find is the HIV proteins are all human proteins that are normally found in everybody. The difference between an HIV test and a normal test is that if you look at the test, because it's just they're lines on a paper, it's called a Western blot. The people who are said to be positive simply have more of certain types of proteins, but they're the same proteins that everybody has.
Jeez.
So
it was like a Rorschach test or something?
Yeah, so this is what people think this is what people think science. I mean, they're actually putting their faith in this, and my fingers are in quotes, science. This is how bad it is. It's really bad.
Wow. And what's one thing I remember I learned that a positive AIDS test in the United States was often a negative AIDS test in Canada. So you could just skip over the border and cure yourself of AIDS. That was the joke.
Well, the problem is, for example, if you have diabetes, you're going to have diabetes in every country that you go to.
Yeah.
So if you have hypertension, you're going to have hypertension in every country you go to, except if you maybe go to Hawaii and lay on the beach, your blood pressure comes down. But do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There are certain parameters that define what a disease situation is. But with HIV, and this is another part of how the fraud goes, because the HIV, and this is the other thing before I say that, if you look at the package inserts for the HIV test, which is an antibody test, every package insert will say that you cannot use that test to diagnose. Yet it's being used to diagnose. And the reason is because of the uncertainty which I just spoke about. But also, so what they did is that if you look at a list of countries or laboratories, practically every country has a different criteria for what's a positive test, and the different laboratories, even within the United States, have a different criteria for what's a positive test. So the test is much more, so if you go to, say, Africa, the test is much more read more liberally than, say, if you go to Australia, where it's read more rigorously. So it's really harder to be a positive in Australia than it is in Africa, where the bar is very low. But the other thing that people should know about Africa, because there's been a lot of psyop on Africa for years, because of Africa is probably the richest continent on the planet. They are incredibly rich in natural resources, and the Western imperial complex is not going to leave that continent alone because of they're extractive and they want it. Mm-hmm. And so they had something called the Bangui Definition, which really was a clinical definition of someone who had a 10% weight loss, a persistent fever, and a cough for a month's duration. Well, that could be tuberculosis. That could be any number of diseases that could afflict someone in a tropical climate. So that means that the usual tropical diseases have turned into AIDS. But the big thing that I discovered also with South Africa was that AIDS became a problem in South Africa only after the fall of apartheid. And this was pretty interesting because pulmonary tuberculosis in the United States, pulmonary tuberculosis, that is lung tuberculosis, was not originally part of the AIDS, the syndrome, the 29 diseases or so. But after the fall of apartheid and the Oppenheimers and the people who owned the gold and diamond mines would be legally liable for the pulmonary diseases that the men in the mines contracted while they were working in the mines, and the infections that they took home to their communities, rather than calling it a work-related problem, that people who had tuberculosis or were exposed to tuberculosis now were told they had a sexually transmitted disease and were HIV positive. And that's why the numbers are so high in South Africa.
It's the get out of liability.
It's a get out of liability scam.
And it's a similar story might explain the polio outbreaks too, from what I understand. But that's another story. But the multi-factor cause of the paralysis, you blame it on a simple virus.
Yeah, and polio is another virus that I looked at. It's never been, also by the rules, the protocols, it's never really been isolated either. So, and I think if you really look at the original literature for each of these viruses, the concept of a virus was developed well over 100 years ago because, once we had microscopes, we could look at bacteria and we could see bacteria in tissue and we could isolate bacteria and then put it in tissue and then the tissue would become infectious. So, but there were other things that we thought were causing infections, but we couldn't see. And so the virus originally was thought to be some kind of a poison or, something in the air that caused something, but it wasn't thought to be a concrete kind of thing. So the concept of a virus started creeping into biology because they thought, well, if there's an infection, there must be something that's causing the infection, rather than some change in metabolism, which is allowing these things to happen to the cell. So they started say, all of these diseases were caused by viruses. And then they discovered the electron microscope, and they were able to kind of take pictures, especially they thought with animal viruses. But it became much more difficult to isolate these so-called viruses from humans. And the problem is this, and it's a simple problem. If your theory is wrong, then everything that you assume about the theory is wrong. For example, if you really don't have a theory of how the cell works, when you see the cell working normally or under stress, you're not going to know what you're really looking at. And unfortunately, that's where we are in biology today. Because, as I said before, the molecular biology and genetic determinist view of biology are dead. They are not predictive, and they don't explain life. And so, in order to explain what they're seeing, there are all of these ad hoc theories which actually contradict each other and don't make medical sense.
Like a pathogenic retrovirus, right?
Like a pathogenic retrovirus. Yeah. And the reason that is so crazy is because 45% of the human genome is made up of what are called retrotransposons, or what it is DNA, which is retrotranscribed by this reverse transcriptase into DNA. So the reverse transcriptase that they identify is a common enzyme in everybody's cell because 45% of our DNA is retrotranscribed. Mm-hmm. It's called retrotransposons. So just finding that particular enzyme is not indicative of a virus. It's simply a normal operating enzyme in all of our cells. And the other important thing about that enzyme is at the end of our cells are these little pieces of material called telomeres. And the telomeres, actually, as we age or the cells become sickened, the cells turn over, the telomeres shorten. But in order to do those telomeres, that's also a reverse transcriptase enzyme, which produces that particular part of the DNA. So reverse transcriptase in no way can be used to identify the uniqueness of something called a virus. It simply cannot.
Mm-hmm. Now, basically what we're saying is with AIDS, the syndrome, the suppressed immunity, was a consequence of various lifestyles that stress the immune system, whether it's drugs, promiscuous sex, overuse of antibiotics. These things, we all know these things will overwhelm and suppress the immune system, and hence you got the syndrome that was called acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Okay, so there are external conditions that were creating this in people, meaning they were living a certain way, over whether it's living in a city, living a fast-track lifestyle, or even in Africa where you have civil wars, economic, social upheaval, poverty,
pollution, industrial pollution,
pollution,
exactly,
rampant use of pesticides. These things will create these illnesses in people. Are you familiar with John Rappaport?
Yeah, I think John Rappaport is one of the best medical investigative journalists on the planet, if not the best, mainly because John understands how the Epidemic Intelligence Service creates a crisis and then it's a problem reaction solution kind of thing. For example, let's say the Zika virus. Let's say that there are certain kinds of chemicals that are known to attack the nervous system, and they're being sprayed widely on the farms in that area. Plus, there's no sanitation, there are open sewers, there's poverty. Mm-hmm. And so the babies start showing up with birth defects, and one of those birth defects are something called microcephaly, or a small head. The brain hasn't developed, but again the poisons that they're putting on the plants are designed to attack the nervous system of the insects. The insects and the humans have the same kind of cells. So a developing embryo, the cells of that developing embryo will be attacked in the same way that insect is attacked. So that you're going to see, if you see that the insect is dying, you're going to see damage in the human tissue as well. And so John understands that you can poison the environment, and as a result of poisoning in the environment, you get a disease. But rather than saying, oh yeah, we're poisoning your kids, they're going to say, oh, there's some virus that's causing the disease, it can't be helped. And then they're going to spray some more.
And say, don't have kids.
Yeah. And then of course that's part of the depopulation eugenics agenda.
He has an expression. He says, the virus is the cover story.
Yeah, the virus is the cover story.
And he wrote in his blog out, and he was investigating HIV back in the 80s. He spoke with a veteran public health worker who was working in Haiti. And the CDC listed Haitians as one of the high-risk groups. And the health worker basically told him that he had no idea what was going on in Haiti. Extreme poverty, people forced off their land, no sanitation, overcrowding, pretty much everything you expect in a country like that, in what they call a lesser developed country or a third world country. So basically what happened was he found that the moment the person improved those conditions, the AIDS went away.
Yeah. Let me just speak to Haiti a little bit. Haiti got its independence before the United States, and I don't know, a lot of people don't know this, but some of the revolutionaries in Haiti came to the United States to help the United States also. But it was the first group of Africans who were able to free themselves from Europe. And Europe has never forgotten that. And so Haiti has become a basket case because the United States and France have put pressure on that country ever since. And they have done everything they can to suppress. For example, if you win a war, generally, if you win the war, the people who you win the war from has to pay you. But France, immediately after they won the war, told Haiti that Haiti owed them money for reparations. So Haiti has been under the yoke of of France and the United States. I mean, they supported Papa Doc and Baby Doc. Mm-hmm. They had Aristide was actually elected. They were I think they were going to kill him. They flew him out of the country, but people got wind of it, so they had to kind of nix that. But, they sent in UN troops. The UN troops brought typhoid to the country. The people had a very good agriculture system. They had these, apparently these small pigs that they used for barter, and the CDC came in and said the pigs had some kind of disease, and so the people had to kill all their pigs. And this is one of the things that the CDC and the World Health Organization is doing with local farmers all over the planet. They're telling the farmers that you have bird flu, you have swine flu, you have this flu, and the local farmers are having to kill all of their livestock, and people are complaining about all of these people from the South coming north, but the North is doing this in the South, putting people off of their land and not allowing them to have a living locally where they are. People don't want to leave their countries.
The same thing occurring in Syria, with Europe, the destabilization, and then
they're getting bombed. Who wants to be bombed?
But you create the mass migration, destabilization, and that creates, I guess the sort of Hegelian dialectic that's exploited by the powers that be.
Yeah, and on this continent, of course, it's NAFTA, which, here comes Hillary Clinton. So her husband was the one who signed NAFTA. And no one wants to talk about the true economic impact of NAFTA. I live in Mexico now. 1 million farmers lost their land after NAFTA.
Mm-hmm. And these are small farmers?
These were small farmers. Yeah. These were peasant farmers who were able to make it was a hard scrap of living, but they were making a living. They were able to feed their families.
And they were independent.
And they were independent, which is a threat. And the other thing now also, but the other half of that is that many of the American factories are now moving to Mexico because the wage scale is so much lower here.
But that's an old practice. I mean, the idea is you dispossess or push the people off their ancestral homelands. They go to the cities, and you get these crowded cities with cheap labor. Then you go in and exploit the labor.
Right, but they're also at the same time driving the wage scale down in the United States. Yeah. So
which is why it's hard to. It's not a not a genuine free market process because there's coercion. At multi levels at this in these deals, because these people are being forced off their land where they have to they have no other option but to work in a factory for.
Well, that's what all these huge trade now it's the TPP and Agenda 21, but NAFTA was like, look, they're going to continue to do this. They're consolidating power, and power is being generated upward, money is being generated upward, and now they claim 62 people have as much money as the rest half of the planet. So that's a lot of money to create havoc.
This is the financial coup that Catherine Austin Fitz talks about.
Yeah, this is a powerful bit of money, which is allowed. She basically says it's what does she call it? A sort of a buyout, that they are able to buy out the country with your own assets. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically what has been happening right under our noses.
And there's it's the economic hitman model, where you go in and you destabilize a country, you saddle it with debt, and the collateral literally is the resources and blood of the people that live there. And they're able to make those deals because they, with local elites that take the money and run or whatever for development projects. And then when the debt's due, the IMF comes in and does these restructuring programs, and pretty much the resources of the country are sold for a song.
Right, and they have the power now that they can just pick off countries one by one. And that's basically what they're doing. I mean, poor Argentina, if anyone is looking at what's going on in Argentina, they've been under the thumb of the IMF and the World Bank for years. And it's sort of, they go from one crisis to another. And the same thing right now is happening in Venezuela. They go from one crisis to another. And they try to say it's a socialist government, but no, it's the pressure, and that may be part of it. I'm not going to say the government is wonderful, but there are outside pressures that come to bear on an individual society are enormous, and it's very hard. It's very hard for any particular society to be able to withstand the pressures that come to bear.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the marketing of AZT to treat AIDS. And that was a drug that had been shelved because it had been proven to be too dangerous in the 60s, correct?
Yeah, it was a chemical that was removed from the sperm of salmon, and it was from fish sperm. And this was of interest to me as a gynecologist, but it was shelved as a cancer drug because they found it caused cancer. It was too toxic to give to cancer patients. So why was of interest that it was taken from a fish sperm? Because, when the sperm fertilizes the egg, the mitochondria, well, first of all, there has to be some sort of toxic chemical to be able to penetrate the egg. But the other thing is that once the sperm penetrates the egg, the mitochondria in the sperm all disappear, because the only mitochondria that we have are from the mother. So all of our mitochondria are only inherited from the mother. So that was fascinating, because we're talking about a chemical that probably suppresses the immune system, because in order for that sperm to penetrate the egg, it has to alter the immune environment in the female, because it's a foreign body. So at any rate, they isolated this AZT and they shelved it. And then now generally it takes about 10 years for a drug to come to market. And the gay community was clamoring and they were desperate. And so they tested this AZT for about 17 weeks, not even months. And it's never a double blind, because people were, finding out who had the medicine and they were using it. And so after 17 weeks of use, they said, okay, it looks like it's working, and they put it on the market. But it wasn't working. There was two large studies, one in the United States and the VA, and another one, a Concord study in Europe. And what happened when AZT was introduced? And this is what actually made it look as if AIDS was a terrible crisis, that AZT really started killing people. The deaths actually increased with AZT, and I'm going to tell you that something that I think is quite evil. After the people started dying, in droves of AZT, because AZT actually attacks the mitochondria. It attacks the energy system of people who already are deficient in energy, and it also reduces the glutathione, which is a sulfur drug, sulfur chemical, which I talked about before. It's a amino acid compound that has sulfur as the main ingredient, which is a reducing agent. So AZT actually made the conditions which the patients had worse, and so they started dying. So the pharmaceutical companies clearly knew that sulfur was a molecule that was missing in these patients, and the patients really needed this sulfur. So in the second and third generation antiretroviral drugs, they started adding a sulfur moiety. Why was this evil? Because it actually replaced some of the sulfur that the patients needed, but they never said, you need sulfur. They just said, take this drug. So they said the patients seemed to be improving or lasting longer. They were, but the thing of it is that because they were partially given some of what they needed, but they were never given the complete thing of what they needed, which was not the drug, but the sulfur itself.
So the AIDS victims or AIDS patients were targeted just to provide a lucrative market for this drug that otherwise would have been sitting on a shelf not making any money for the pharmaceutical companies.
It would not have been making any money, but the second and third generation drugs is that they began to add the sulfur to the drugs to make it look like they were working, so that they could say the drugs are now improving the outcomes of the patients and the patients are not dying. But also the other thing that was happening, especially in the gay community, is the word got out this amyl nitrate and some of their habits were not working for them. And so the amyl nitrate use really diminished, and one of the cancers that was associated with amyl nitrate, Kaposi sarcoma, practically went away after that.
Which, by the way, is virtually non-existent in Africa, right? With supposed AIDS patient victim.
Right. There's Kaposi sarcoma is known in Africa, but it's not part of the AIDS syndrome on the continent of Africa. Yeah.
This.
And by the way, it was only in the subset of gay men who used amyl nitrate, and they could never. And of course, the women who because some of these men were bisexual, the women who had sex with these men, of course, never developed Kaposi sarcoma.
So, thus proving that it was that that was not the cause.
Right, because it wasn't an infectious disease problem; it was an environmental toxin problem.
Now, you mentioned so this exposes the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex. They're intentionally or knowingly making their patients sicker just to make more money. Now, this is part of an entire industry or way of looking at the world. And you get in your book about Rockefeller and some of the other titans of industry that sought to monopolize medicine in the early 20th century. Can you quickly explain how that process happened and what impact it had on our world today?
Well, I think it's important to, just to look at Rockefeller as a case study, because he comes from his father was a very interesting rogue. He was actually a criminal. He was a scoundrel. He was he called himself a doctor, but really he was a scam artist. And he apparently raped a woman in upstate New York, and the family had to leave and go out to Ohio. And when they were in Ohio, at that time, oil had just been discovered in Pennsylvania. So he bottled this oil and put it in a jar and called it Nujol, Nujol, and said it was a cure for cancer. And he went around the countryside selling it as a cure for cancer. Of course, it made cancer worse because it had to be detoxified in the liver, and it was really, the liver is one of the most important detoxifying organs in your body, and so it was people were dying faster. But when Rockefeller, he was an oil man, and so he learned from his father, and the father used to cheat the boys in order just to see if the boys could outsmart them. So they were really raised in a very negative kind of environment in terms of it was a psychopathic environment in terms of their father and how their father raised them. So when Rockefeller began to consolidate his oil business, he also began to take on his father's patent medicine, which he began to sell also. Now, how does the oil industry and the pharmaceutical industry, how do they mesh? Well, most of the pharmaceutical drugs, especially at that time, were being manufactured in Germany, and they came out of coal tar and oil products. That was the original organic chemistry. And so what they found is that they manufacture compounds which they could sell to the general public. So the oil industry and the pharmaceutical industry became joined at the hip from early on. The other thing is, in order to be able to sell their products, they had to be able to create a market and control the market, because Rockefeller was all about creating and controlling markets. And so he had a study done in the early part of the 20th century to look at medical education in the United States. And so they decided that they were only going to support something called allopathic medicine, because that was a way of selling the pharmaceutical drugs. So the study actually, after it was done, many of the medical schools in the United States closed, and many of them deserved to close because a lot of them were terrible. But there were also other methods of healing. We had homeopathy, naturopathy, there was herbal medicine. There were a lot of ways that people were healing themselves in the early part of the 20th century. And people from Africa, from Europe, the Native Americans, all had traditions, healing traditions that they brought to this country. which worked. And however, they said that they were going to make medicine a science, and so they created these. They hired physicians that they thought would go along with them, and they only gave money to those medical schools which would train physicians in the way they wanted them to be trained. And essentially, physicians are trained to be salesmen for patent medicine. That's what an allopathic physician is. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm an allopathic physician, and certainly allopathy does good work, and there are lots of good things to say about allopathic medicine, but it's not the only type of medicine, but it's the only type that the Rockefeller Institute and those people supported, and it continues today to be the dominant paradigm in the world.
And this, I guess you mentioned the study, that was the Flexner report?
It was the Flexner report, yes. And so the Flexners were interesting. They were an interesting family because they were involved not only in science, they were involved in politics. And they certainly seemed to be, one of the Flexners was head of the Rockefeller Institute, and was very much involved in genetics work. And the importance of this is that the Flexners were Jewish. And I think that, there's always a confusion about the role of the Jewish community in eugenics. But if you look at Israel and how Israel and the Ashkenazis in Israel have defined themselves as Jews, and the original Jews are no longer Jews, then I think you understand that that's a concept that could be that works with that community, even though they claim to have been victims of eugenics, and some of them were, but the leaders of their community have been staunch eugenicists for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So they're in league with the other eugenicists, like the Rockefellers.
Absolutely, because there's no other group on this planet that says they want a pure race. I mean, they don't make any bones about it. Mm-hmm. They don't make any bones about not wanting, people to marry into other religions and other cultures. They're really clear about that. Especially, they don't want their men and women to marry Arabs, and they're making it. And although there are many of the Israelis that are married to Arabs, they're making it increasingly difficult. They have been very abusive to the Ethiopians, who were Jews thousands of years before the Ashkenazis were converted in the 8th century. Mm-hmm. So, Israel is it's not the friend of, I don't believe Israel is the friend of the United States, and I think that they're the cause, the proximate cause of a lot of the chaos that's going on in the world today.
Of course, it was the fear of assimilation which motivated much of the Zionist cause.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, because Zionism is not a religion; it's a political cause, mm-hmm. and it's a criminal cause, because it's about having a place where people can do international crimes, and then it's like a pirate cove. They can be safe from the consequences of their international crimes.
Yeah. Now, you had a paragraph in your book, I think, sums up the role of allopathic medicine in the the whole economic order that we live under today. It went like this, if you bear with me. It says, "My studies brought me to the realization that the allopathic medical profession is controlled from the top by the same interests that control banking, oil, precious metals, the military, and associated intelligence agencies, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, IMF, and the various foundations and think tanks that frame and limit all level of intellectual inquiry in the United States and throughout the empire." And that's a wonderful summation, I think, of what you're expressing there. So that's a...
Yeah, I'm. What I try to do is a systems analysis. Mm-hmm. It would have been wonderful to have some sort of computer to sort of put things in to see how they're all connected. And some people have done that. I've actually seen some good systems work on the computer. but by other people, that you can, you can scroll over something, you can see all the lines to all the things that they're connected to, or a particular person.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you, at this point in our history, you cannot look at any industry or anything as if as if it's an island floating out there by itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because the whole concept of globalization is the concept of consolidating power in a few hands, and that means power over all of those industries that impact our lives. And so there is this interrelationship between various industries, government, and the military, and that is increasingly, I think it's becoming increasingly clear to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. It's full spectrum dominance, as the Pentagon would call it.
Yeah, for example, many of the people who look, when I started out in obstetrics and gynecology, the rate of autism was 1 in 10,000. It's now I think it's 1 in 50, and that's in 30 years. So clearly that's not genetic, because the genetic things don't change that fast. So it's environmental.
It's not better diagnostics either. So.
And it's not better, of course. 1 in 50 to 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 50. Please. So there's something seriously going on with our children. Our children are being damaged. But if you understand that in terms of the eugenics paradigm, and the expressed desire of people like Bill Gates and others to want fewer people on the planet, you understand why they're doing that. Because these children who have autism are not going to reproduce in the future. They're going to be a generation of burdensome people on their families and the community, because they're never going to be able to fit in. They're never going to be productive. They're always going to be out of control. And they're not going to contribute to the society, and they certainly are not going to reproduce. So you almost are wiping out a generation of people with just that one problem, by itself.
And the fact that you could go to those proportions could change so drastically in so few years, and have there not be outrage, universal outrage, is telling.
Right.
It's a testimony to mind control.
It's a great testimony, because because people will argue with you, and it doesn't matter. Truth is no longer important. It's the impression that programming gives. Mm-hmm. And once a person is programmed, it doesn't. It's something called cognitive dissonance sets in. It doesn't matter how much evidence you give them; they are not going to change their minds. And so, and I've seen. I've talked to a lot of patients, and I've gone to meetings. And when do these parents change their mind? Well, they keep. Once they have their second or third kid, okay, the third kid gets autism, and now they're ready to be up in arms. But it's like cigarette smoking. If you don't know the cigarettes smoking causes cancer by now with the kinds of cigarettes they have on the market, then you're living on a different planet. And it's the same thing with autism and vaccines. If you don't really get that these vaccines are related to this epidemic of autism, then you're living on a different planet. And unfortunately, a lot of parents are living on a different planet because they don't want to know until their child